Okay, I wanted to expand on the previous video a bit. Sorry for the cheesiness and low quality of the previous video, but I think it does a great job of kind of explaining the basic ideas of offset printing. So here's a beautiful offset press. This is much cleaner than most. Let's see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Later, we'll talk about why a press would have more than 4 towers. So at least 4 of these towers would be filled with cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, typically. Here's the stack of the stack of paper is over on the left. You can see near the operator. So this is what the ink canisters typically look like. It's just a small can of ink that gets put into the press. Here's the towers open. You can see the ink on the top of the towers, which is typically where you put that in onto those rollers, and it kind of mixes there with the water. Here's another open tower. This is a man holding a plate. This plate essentially acts like a stamp. That plate goes onto the roller. There's a plate on the top there, goes onto the roller. The image gets transferred to that rubber blanket on the bottom, and then the rubber blanket stamps it onto the paper. And so you can think of this as just very much like a rubber stamping process. And there's just 4 stamps involved in process printing: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. I want to talk about that a little bit more. So imagine this image then being translated into cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. I'm going to escape out of this and jump into Photoshop. Photoshop allows you to get into the channels. So here are the separate channels, and you can see the individual channels here. This image is set to CMYK, and so I can click on individual channels and see what that channel would look like. If we jump into the yellow channel, you can see this. The jacket is almost black. His shirt is almost black. This jacket here is almost black. Black meaning full color. So if this is the yellow plate here, it makes sense that this jacket would be almost 100% color because it is yellow. His shirt is yellow. You can see magenta. This jacket is almost 100% magenta here. And so the stamp, this is what the magenta stamp would look like. If you dipped a stamp that had kind of full coverage here into the ink and stamped it on a piece of paper, this is what it would look like. Photoshop will allow you to kind of turn on channels one at a time, and as soon as you do that, they become their actual colors. And so if you had just stamped the yellow and the magenta onto a piece of paper, this is what it would look like. If you added the yellow, this is what it would look like. And then when you add the black, you see the kind of full range of color within that. All right, let's jump back to our slideshow. So the question is, how do we get to different values? The ink colors are, when they're stamped, like any stamp, the ink is either 100% color or 0% color. It's either on or off, right? If you dip a stamp in ink and push it down on a piece of paper, it's not going to be a darker or a lighter value. How would you get the darker and lighter value? And how offset printing works is it uses a dot pattern to achieve that. Let me zoom in here. This is called a halftone pattern. And so it uses larger and smaller dots in order to get lighter and darker values. And so when you add the 4 colors together, we have lighter and darker versions of the cyan mixed with lighter and darker versions of the magenta, gives you all the variety of colors that you would see in a typical image. We're going to talk later about spot color printing, but we're talking about process color printing, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So you can see here how those values are achieved. The last thing I want to bring up is the term for the distance between the dots, you can see the distance between the dots is actually uniform. So the distance between the center of the cyan dot from dot to dot versus the center of the magenta dot for dot, is exactly the same throughout the printing page. The distance between the dots does not change. The size of the dots does. That's what gets the value. So different printed objects will have different distances. The term for that is line screen. There's a couple of terms for it, really. Line screens and LPI, lines per inch. So LPI, line screen, same thing. Different printed objects, magazines, newspapers, all the variety of things, may have different line screens. They may have different lines per, a different number of lines per inch. For example, a standard line screen would be 150 LPI. At 150 LPI, lines per inch, you cannot see the dot pattern with the naked eye. If you get down to 85 line screen, you can see the dots just by looking closely at a piece of printed material. So you may ask, well, why not just always use high line screens or 150 or above to where you couldn't see the dot pattern? By the way, the higher the line screen, the more detail you're going to see. And so, for example, in this image on the left, you can see it's an eye. You may be able to see eyelashes if you get really, individual eyelashes if you have a really high line screen, depending, of course, on how big the image is on the piece of paper. But, so again, down to why would you ever use something like 85 line screen? And here's the reason. You can see, like, on the bottom, you have the dots are kind of rough, whereas on the top of the image, the dots are really sharp. That is likely due to the quality of the paper. Imagine if you take a felt tip pen and put it down onto a piece of newsprint on kind of porous, uncoated paper. If you put that, as soon as you put that ink, the pen down on it, you can imagine the paper just kind of soaking it up. Versus if you put that felt tip pen down on a high quality magazine, so a coated paper, that is, when you put that pen down, the ink is not going to spread. It's not going to get any larger. They call that dot gain. That's what you're seeing on the bottom half. So cheaper papers like newsprint will have a lot of dot gain. So newspapers usually are printed down around 85 line screen. So if you grab any newspaper, you could pick it up, and if you look closely, you'll be able to see the dots. And so the images are lower resolution. You don't see as much detail in images in a newspaper. The lines aren't quite as crisp. Whereas on a high quality magazine, they may have 175 line screen or even higher because the paper is such a high quality that it can handle the higher dots. If you printed 150 line screen on a newspaper, the colors would get kind of muddy and it just wouldn't look as good. So I hope this helps explain in a little more detail some of the aspects of offset printing.